The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 1. I moved to Brooklyn Heights a few months ago, drawn by the quiet streets and the old charm of the brownstone buildings. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a pre-war building, the kind with creaky wooden floors and a fire escape that rattled in the wind. It wasn't perfect, thin walls, dim lighting in the hallways, but it was mine. Work had been exhausting lately, and I was looking forward to some stability, a place where I could come home, shut the door, and breathe. At first, everything seemed normal. My neighbors mostly kept to themselves, the noise from the street was manageable, and my routines quickly settled into place. But then I started noticing him. The man in the window across from mine. Every evening, no matter what time I got home, he was already there. A tall, gaunt figure standing in the window of the apartment directly across the narrow alleyway, staring out. At first, I assumed he was just a neighbor with a peculiar habit. Maybe he liked to people watch or was lost in his own thoughts. But something about the way he stood there, perfectly still, unsettled me. His apartment was dark behind him, no lamps, no movement, just the silhouette of his body against the dim city glow. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was being paranoid. New York is full of strange people, but then I noticed something that made my stomach clench. He wasn't just standing there. He was mimicking me. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. I'd reach up to loosen my tie, and he'd do the same. I'd run a hand through my hair, and across the alley, he mirrored me, down to the exact timing. I tested it, lifting my arm slowly, tilting my head to the side. Every motion I made, he copied in perfect sync, like my reflection in a dark, warped mirror. My skin prickled with unease. This wasn't just a man standing in his window. This was something else. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate joke, or maybe he had a twin who moved at the same time as me. But the longer I watched, the harder it became to explain. There was no delay, no hesitation in his mimicry. Even the smallest, most unconscious gestures, blinking, shifting my weight, he copied with eerie precision. And yet, his face remained obscured by shadows, just a silhouette against the dim light of the city. I stopped looking. It was the only way I could pretend it wasn't happening. I forced myself to ignore the window, to go about my routine as if I didn't feel his presence lingering just beyond the glass. But the feeling never left me. That crawling sensation on my skin, like I was being watched, even when I wasn't. Looking, I started keeping my blinds closed, but that only made it worse because now, every time I left the apartment or came home, I felt this overwhelming need to check, to see if he was still there. And he always was. Rain, snow, early morning, or late at night, it didn't matter. He stood in that same spot, never moving except to mimic me. My mind spiraled with possibilities. Was he some kind of stalker, a hallucination, a ghost? The thought of confronting him made my stomach twist, but I knew I couldn't keep living. Like this, I needed answers. That night, I made up my mind. As soon as I got home, I would go straight to his door. No more avoiding it, no more pretending it wasn't happening. I needed to see him up close, to hear his voice, to prove to myself that he was just a man and not some impossible reflection of my own movements. My hands were clammy as I crossed the hallway and knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Silence. The hallway suddenly felt too quiet, the air too thick. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, movement. But there was nothing, just a deep, hollow stillness. Then, as I reached for the doorknob, I noticed something that made my breath hitch. The dust. A thick layer of it covered the floor in front of the door, undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of life. I stepped back, my pulse pounding in my ears. That apartment hadn't been touched in a long time, but that didn't make sense. How? Could someone be inside, standing at the window every night, if no one had set foot in there for months, maybe years? My mind fought against the implications, grasping for logic where there was none. I turned, half expecting to see him watching me from the window, but the glass was dark and empty. For the first time since I moved in, the figure was gone. A cold dread settled in my stomach as I backed away from the door. I needed confirmation. I ran downstairs to the building superintendent, an old man who'd lived there for decades. When I asked about the tenant in 3B, his face twisted in confusion. "Nobody's lived there in years," he said. "That place has been empty since the last guy disappeared. Weirdest thing. Left all his stuff behind, but he was just gone." I felt the blood drain from my face. "That's impossible," I muttered. "I've seen someone in there every night, watching me." The superintendent shook his head, his expression grim. "You must be mistaken," he said. "There's no power in that unit. No one's got a key except me." His words sent a chill down my spine. If no one had been inside, then what had been standing in that window all this time? Against my better judgment, I asked him to unlock the apartment. I needed to see it with my own eyes. He hesitated, but eventually led me upstairs, the old keys jingling in his hand. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a space frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture, yellowed newspapers on the table, dishes still in the sink, like someone had left in a hurry and never returned. And then I saw it. The window, the same one I'd looked at every night. Except now, standing here, I realized something horrifying. There was no way anyone could have been standing there. The layout of the apartment was wrong. The window faced a wall. Not an alley, not another building, just solid, cracked brick, inches away from the glass. My stomach turned as I stepped closer, pressing my hand against the cold, grimy pane. I had seen him. Night after night I had watched him watching me, but from where? My reflection stared back at me in the darkened glass, and for the first time I saw it, the faintest outline of something else behind me, something that shouldn't be there. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. The superintendent must have seen my face because he grabbed my arm. "You okay?" he asked. My mouth was dry. I couldn't answer. I turned, rushing out of the apartment, out of the building, out into the cold night air. I never looked at that window again. But sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I still feel it. That pull, that weight of unseen eyes, watching, waiting, and worst of all, I know now, if I ever dare to look again, I might not be the one doing the watching. Now that you've read this, take a second to glance at your own window. Are you sure you're the only one looking? If you've ever experienced something like this, tell me in the comments. I need to know I'm not alone. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 2. I moved to Los Angeles 3 years ago, chasing the same dream as thousands of others, the dream of seeing my name in the credits, of standing under bright lights, of making something of myself in a city that swallows the nameless whole. My apartment on Mulholland Drive wasn't glamorous, but it had a view of the city that shimmered at night like broken glass. It was small, quiet, and most importantly, mine. I lived alone, which I preferred. The silence helped me focus on auditions, script readings, and sometimes the slow realization that my career wasn't unfolding the way I had imagined. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked neatly under my front door. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe a misplaced note from a neighbor. But when I read it, my stomach tightened. It was a short, typewritten message on plain white paper. The pasta was a good choice. You always make too much, though. I laughed it off, telling myself it was some kind of weird joke, maybe a friend messing with me. maybe a fan, but I wasn't famous, far from it. My name barely meant anything outside of casting rooms. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash, brushing off the unease crawling up my spine. A week passed before the second letter arrived. This time, it was slipped through the mail slot in the middle of the night. I found it the next morning, lying on my welcome mat like a dead thing. "You cried last night. That song always gets to you, doesn't it?" My breath caught in my throat. I had in fact cried the night before. A stupid emotional breakdown at 2 a.m., alone in my apartment, with Billie Holiday's "I'll Be Seeing You" playing softly from my laptop. I hadn't told anyone about it. I hadn't even texted a friend. I checked the locks, the windows, the tiny peephole in my door. Everything was secure. Still, the idea that someone had seen me in such a vulnerable moment made my skin itch. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone heard the music and guessed. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This was something else. Someone was watching me. The letters kept coming. Once a week, always typed, always unnervingly precise. "Red looks good on you. You should wear it more often. You forgot to lock your door last night. You talk in your sleep. Do you know what you say?" Each note was a knife twisting deeper, turning my apartment from a safe haven into a glass cage. I stopped opening my curtains. I double-checked every lock. I barely slept. The city outside felt indifferent, uncaring, as if it could swallow me whole and no one would notice. Then, last night, the pattern changed. I was sitting at my kitchen table, absent-mindedly scrolling through casting calls, when I heard the familiar rustle of paper sliding through the mail slot. My stomach clenched. I didn't want to read it. I told myself to throw it away, but my hands betrayed me, unfolding the letter with trembling fingers. "You shouldn't ignore me." That was all it said. No observations, no taunts, just a warning. Something inside me snapped. Fear had kept me passive, but now anger bubbled up, hot and reckless. I stormed to the door and yanked it open, stepping into the hallway. Empty. The air was still, thick, with the scent of stale carpet. I ran down the stairs, out onto the street, scanning the shadows between parked cars, the dim glow of the streetlights. Nothing. No footsteps retreating, no suspicious figures lurking. Whoever was doing this, whoever was watching me, was a ghost. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the building sent my heart hammering against my ribs. Every distant sound outside made me hold my breath. By dawn, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off on my couch with the TV on for background noise. When I woke up, sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting striped patterns on the floor. My laptop was still open on the coffee table, and there on the screen was a new email. No sender, no subject, just 2 words in the body of the message: "Turn around." A cold wave of dread washed over me. My body refused to move, every muscle locked in place. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't turn around. Instead, I reached for my phone, hands shaking as I pulled up the camera and switched to the front-facing view. The screen flickered for a moment before the image appeared. My reflection stared back at me, but I wasn't alone. Behind me, just at the edge of the frame, was a figure, tall, still, just out of focus, like a shadow not meant to be there. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the moment I saw it, something changed in the air, like the pressure in the room shifted, thick and suffocating. My fingers fumbled, nearly dropping the phone. As I whipped around, there was nothing there. The space behind me was empty, just my small apartment, the dim morning light filtering through the blinds, the silence pressing against my ears. But I knew what I had seen. My chest rose and fell, in sharp, panicked breaths, as I stared at the spot where the figure had been. The apartment felt different now, violated, as if I had been living alongside something, unaware, until the moment it decided to let me see it. My stomach churned. I grabbed my laptop, my phone, my keys, anything I could reach, and bolted for the door. I didn't care where I went, I just needed to be out. I stumbled down the stairs into the street, the cold morning air biting at my skin. People passed by, their lives untouched by the horror unraveling inside mine. I stood there, shaking, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me, and then, like clockwork, my phone buzzed. A notification, an email. With trembling hands, I unlocked my phone and opened the email. This time there was no cryptic message, no demand, just an attachment, a single image. My breath hitched as I tapped it. The photo loaded slowly, the pixels sharpening into something that made my blood run cold. It was me, standing exactly where I was now, outside on the sidewalk. The angle was high, like it had been taken from above, from my apartment window. My stomach dropped. I spun around, eyes darting up to the windows of my building. My blinds were still half closed, the narrow gaps between them dark and impenetrable. But something in my gut told me something was still there, watching, waiting. I backed, away, forcing myself to move, to leave, to run if I had to. But just as I turned, my phone buzzed again. Another email. One final message, 3 words, typed in that same cold, impersonal font. Don't look up. Now that you've heard my story, try not to think about it when you're alone. And if you ever feel like someone's watching, maybe they are, let me know in the comments if anything like this has ever happened to you. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 3. I rented the apartment in the French Quarter for the quiet, or at least as much quiet as you can find in a place like New Orleans. The building was old, historically preserved, as the landlord proudly told me, but it had a certain charm. Brick walls, high ceilings, iron-railed balconies. It was the kind of place where you could feel the weight of history pressing down on you. Exactly the kind of atmosphere I needed to finish my book. I was on a deadline, and my publisher had been breathing down my neck for months. A change of scenery was supposed to help. At first, it did. During the day, I wrote in coffee shops, soaking in the energy of the city. At night, I sat at my small wooden desk, typing away with the windows open, the sounds of distant jazz floating in from Bourbon Street. But after the first week, I started to notice something strange. Every night at exactly 2:13 a.m., I would hear footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, a soft creak of floorboards, the faint sound of someone shifting their weight. It wouldn't have been strange, except for one thing. The apartment above mine was supposed to be empty. I told myself it was nothing. Old buildings made noises, wood expanded and contracted, pipes groaned, and the wind sometimes played tricks on the mind. But as the nights passed, the sounds became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. Sometimes I swore I could hear faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. Once I even heard what sounded like a chair being dragged across the floor. I asked the landlord about it the next morning, casually bringing it up, as if I wasn't already on edge. He frowned, shaking his head. "That apartment's been locked. Up for months," he said. "Nobody's in there." Then, as if that explained everything, he shrugged and went back to his work. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just stressed from writing. But that night, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the sounds returned. Heavier this time, almost purposeful. And for the first time, I had the overwhelming sense that whatever was up there wasn't just moving. It was listening. I tried to ignore it. I put on headphones, played white noise, did everything I could to block it out. But the unease settled deep in my chest, making it impossible to focus. My writing slowed. The words didn't come as easily. I found myself glancing up at the ceiling more often, waiting for the inevitable sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps. Then, on the 10th night, something changed. The noises stopped. I should have been relieved, but the silence felt heavier, oppressive, as if the air itself was holding its breath. That's when I heard it, a soft rustling near the door. My stomach twisted as I watched a small piece of paper slip through the gap and land on the wooden floor. I hesitated before picking it up. My hands felt cold, a strange prickle running up my spine as I unfolded the note. 4 words, scrawled in uneven handwriting. I already know how your story ends. My breath hitched. It had to be a joke. Someone messing with me. A neighbor, maybe. But as I turned the paper over, my chest tightened. Below the message was a passage from my book, a passage I hadn't written yet. The words were mine, the phrasing unmistakable, but I had never put them to paper. Not yet. I dropped the note like it burned me. My mind raced for an explanation. Maybe I had written the passage in a notebook and forgotten. Maybe I had spoken the words out loud and someone had overheard. But deep down, I knew neither of those answers made sense. No one else had seen my notes. No one had access to my drafts. And yet there it was. Someone had written my words before I had. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old building sent a jolt through my body. The footsteps never returned, but the silence was worse. It stretched on, thick and unnatural, as if waiting for me to react. By morning, I convinced myself it had to be some elaborate prank. Someone had to be messing with me. So I did the only thing I could. I rewrote the ending. With trembling hands, I reached for the note, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The paper was identical to the first, aged, slightly crumpled at the edges. But this time, there were no taunts, no cryptic messages. Just another passage from my book. The new ending, the one I had only just written. I stared at the words, my own words, perfectly copied onto the page. A cold realization settled over me. It didn't matter how many times I changed the story, something already new. And worse, it was waiting for me to understand that no matter how I tried to rewrite it, my ending had already been decided. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved. But the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 4. I moved into my apartment on the Magnificent Mile about 6 months ago. It was a dream come true. Tall windows overlooking the city, a cozy layout, and just enough charm to make it feel like home. My neighbors, mostly kept to themselves, except for Mr. Albright, the elderly man in 6B. He had lived there for decades, always polite but with an odd air about him. He would greet me in the hallway with a slow nod, his milky blue eyes lingering just a little too long. At first, I chalked it up to old age, harmless curiosity. But something about the way he watched me unsettled me. It wasn't until last week that I had a real reason to be disturbed. I'd been coming back from work late when I found my door slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I was sure I had locked it. But when I stepped inside, everything was in place. Nothing missing, nothing out of order. I convinced myself I must have been careless and locked it behind me, shaking off the unease. The next morning, as I stepped out for coffee, Mr. Albright was standing in his doorway, waiting. "I have something to show you," he said, voice raspy with age. His smile was thin, almost eager. I hesitated, gripping my keys a little tighter. But refusing would feel rude, and despite the lingering discomfort, he was just an old man. Harmless. So I stepped inside his apartment. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old books and something faintly metallic. The decor was dated, heavy. Drapes, dark wooden furniture, walls crowded with framed paintings. And then I saw it. Hanging above his fireplace was a painting of me, not just a vague likeness, but an exact, intimate portrayal. Me, sleeping. My hair sprawled across my pillow, my face peaceful, my breathing barely visible in the rise and fall of my chest. My skin went cold. "That's—" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. "That's me." Mr. Albright chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that sent a shiver up my spine. "I always liked watching you sleep," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a step back, glancing at the door, calculating the distance. "How did you—" My voice wavered. "Where? Did you get this?" He tilted his head, as if considering whether to answer. "I paint what I see," he finally said, his cloudy eyes gleaming. My stomach twisted. That wasn't possible. The details were too perfect, down to the tiny scar on my collarbone, the curve of my lips in sleep. A sickening thought crawled into my mind. Was he watching me inside my apartment? I forced myself to look at the painting again, my breath coming in shallow gasps. That's when I noticed it. Something I hadn't registered at first. In the background near the edge of the bed was a shadow, a figure, someone standing over me as I slept. My throat tightened. Who is that?" I whispered, pointing. At the dark shape in the painting, Mr. Albright's smile widened, his thin lips stretching unnaturally. "Oh," he said, almost fondly. "You see him too?" My body locked up. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. The shadowy figure in the painting wasn't just a trick of the light. It was deliberate, defined, and the way it leaned toward my sleeping form, watching, made my skin crawl. I took another step back, my heel nearly catching on the edge of a rug. "What do you mean, I see him too?" My voice was barely above. A whisper. Mr. Albright let out a breathy chuckle, as if I had just stumbled upon a private joke. "Most people don't notice at first," he mused, his eyes flicking to the painting. "But once you see him, he sees you too." A chill wrapped around my spine like a tightening grip. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the painting. The shadowy figure seemed wrong. Its edges weren't blurred like the rest of the soft brushstrokes. It was sharper, more deliberate, almost as if it had been added after the rest of the painting had dried. And then I saw something that made my stomach lurch. Its head was turned toward me, just slightly, like it was aware of my gaze. I couldn't be in that room any longer. My body moved before my mind caught up. I turned, nearly stumbling as I rushed to the door. "Thank you for showing me," I forced out, my voice tight with forced calm. My fingers trembled as I gripped the handle. Mr. Albright didn't try to stop me. "Sleep well," he murmured as I stepped out, his voice laced with something I couldn't place. I barely registered my walk back to my apartment. The second I was inside, I locked the door, bolted it, and shoved a chair beneath the knob. My hands were shaking. It was just a painting, I told myself. A deeply unsettling, inexplicable painting, but paint on canvas nonetheless. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the more I felt that same chill creep over my skin. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the shadow in the painting burned behind my eyelids. I kept my bedside lamp on, my ears tuned to every creak and rustle in my apartment. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a fitful sleep until something jolted me awake. A sound, a whisper. My heart pounded as I lay frozen, listening. The room was still, but something felt different, off. My eyes flickered toward the corner of my bedroom, where the dim light from my lamp didn't quite reach. The shadows there looked deeper than they should have, darker. And for a split second, I swore I saw movement, a shift, as if something had been standing there and had just stepped back, melting into the darkness. I sat up so fast my head spun, my breath coming in short gasps. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, and swept the beam across the room. Nothing. Just the same furniture, the same walls. But the feeling didn't leave. It clung to my skin like a damp chill, a suffocating weight pressing against my chest. I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, eyes locked on the corner where the shadows had seemed too deep. When the first light of dawn crept through my window, I finally dared to move. I had to know. With hesitant steps, I approached my closet mirror, heart hammering. My reflection stared back, tired and pale. But there, just behind me, was something else. A shadow, tall, watching. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved. But the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 5. I moved into my apartment at Fisherman's Wharf 6 months ago. It wasn't perfect. Old building and thin walls, the occasional rat scurrying in the alley, but the view of the bay made up for it. My job kept me busy, and I was rarely home during the day. But lately, something had been bothering me. I started noticing small things at first. A chair slightly moved from where I left it. My bedroom door cracked open when I was sure I had shut it. At first, I blamed my own absent-mindedness. Maybe I was rushing out in the morning, not paying attention. But then, one night, I came home and found my fridge door ajar. That's when I knew I wasn't imagining it. The thought of someone sneaking into my place made my skin crawl. My landlord insisted the locks were fine and the building didn't have security cameras. So I decided to install my own. Just a simple motion detection system. One camera facing my front door, another in the living room. I figured it would either confirm my paranoia or put my mind at ease. The first few nights, nothing unusual happened. I checked the footage religiously. After work, only to see an empty hallway and the occasional neighbor passing by. But then, on the fourth night, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My next-door neighbor, an older man I had only exchanged a few words with, was standing right outside my door. Just standing there. At first, I thought he might have been waiting for someone. But as I skimmed through the footage, I realized he had been there for hours. Not moving, not shifting his weight, just staring directly at the camera. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was sleepwalking. Maybe he had dementia. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next night it happened again. Same time, same position. No blinking, no expression. I told myself I'd confront him. Maybe he didn't even realize what he was doing. But when I saw him in the hallway the next morning, he acted completely normal. He nodded at me, muttered a quick morning, and went inside his apartment. No sign of recognition, no trace of the unsettling behavior I'd seen on the footage. That night, I kept my laptop open, the camera feed running live as I lay in bed. At exactly 2:13 a.m., there he was again, standing in the dimly lit hallway, imperfectly still, his face illuminated by the small red light of the camera. I stared at my screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, something even worse happened. For the first time, he moved. Not normally, not like a person shifting their weight or scratching an itch. His head snapped toward the camera, as if he knew I was watching. And then he smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A slow, deliberate curling of his lips. I slammed my laptop shut. The next day, I took the footage to the building manager. He barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "Yeah, that's just Mr. Evans. He's lived here forever. Bit odd, but harmless." Harmless? I showed him the part where the man stood there for hours, the eerie grin. The manager just sighed. "Look, if he's not actually coming inside, there's nothing we can do." I wasn't satisfied with that answer. Harmless or not, this wasn't normal. So that night, I decided to stay awake and watch in real time. I set up my laptop again, turned off all the lights, and waited. 2:13 a.m. The feed flickered slightly, then stabilized, and there he was, standing in the same spot, staring. My breath caught in my throat, but this time, something was different. His face wasn't fully visible. The top of his head seemed cut off. I frowned, adjusting the brightness. Then I realized why. He was closer, not just a little. He was inches from the camera, his face nearly pressed against my door. My stomach twisted. He hadn't been there a second ago. How had he moved so fast? I watched frozen as his mouth began to move. No sound came through. The cameras had no audio, but his lips were forming words, slowly, methodically, over and over. I grabbed my phone, recording the screen, trying to make sense of what he was saying, and then the feed cut out. The screen went black. No error message, no static, just nothing. My heart pounded as I tried refreshing the feed. The camera app wouldn't load. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, ready to call someone, anyone. But before I could dial, a notification popped up. Motion detected, living room. I felt a cold wave of dread crash over me. The living room camera, that meant he was inside. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I just sat there gripping my phone, my mind racing. How? The front door was locked, the windows were shut. He had been in the hallway just seconds ago. With shaking hands, I forced myself to open the live feed. At first, I saw nothing. Just my dimly lit living room, silent and still. Then, ever. So slowly, the camera adjusted to the darkness. And that's when I saw him, standing in the middle of the room. He wasn't facing the camera. He stood with his back to it, his head slightly tilted, as if he was listening for something. My breath hitched. I wanted to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't move. Then, slowly, too slowly, his head began to turn. But not the way a person should turn their head. His neck twisted at an unnatural angle, further than it should go, until his face was almost completely backward, and he was smiling. I threw my laptop off my lap and bolted. I didn't think about grabbing anything. I just ran for the door, fumbling with the lock, my hands slick with sweat. I yanked it open and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. But the hallway was empty. No sign of him, no sound. Just the quiet hum of the flickering hallway light. My mind reeled. He had been inside my apartment. I had seen him. But when I glanced back at my open door, the living room was exactly as I had left it. I stood there, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. My apartment was silent. No movement, no shadows, nothing out of place. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it. Then, a notification lit up my phone screen. Motion detected, front door. My breath hitched. Slowly, I turned my gaze toward the camera feed, dreading what I would see. And there he was, standing in the hallway, staring at me. Only now, there was something different. The grin was gone. His face was blank, hollow, and he wasn't standing still anymore. He was stepping forward. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. I don't even remember how I got out of the building. I just remember sprinting down the street, not stopping until I was surrounded by people, by noise, by anything that felt real. I never went back. I moved out the next day, breaking my lease, leaving everything behind. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night feeling watched, I swear I see it, a shadow just beyond the doorway, a shape standing too still, waiting. Now that you've read this, tell me, have you ever noticed someone staring just a little too long? Someone who shouldn't be there, but is. Maybe check your security cameras tonight. You never know who's watching. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 1. I moved to Beacon Hill, Boston, a few months. Go for college. The apartment was small but cozy, exposed brick walls, creaky wooden floors, the kind of place that had history. I lived alone, which I actually liked. No roommates leaving dishes in the sink, no awkward small talk. Just me, my books, and late-night study sessions with coffee that never seemed to work. The building was old, but not in a creepy way. More like it had character. The only weird thing was the Wi-Fi. It barely worked in certain corners of my place, and sometimes I'd see strange network names pop up. Don't look up, I'm watching. Probably some neighbor's idea of a joke. I never thought much of it. Then last night I got a text from an unknown number. Your hair looks pretty when it's wet. My stomach twisted. I had just stepped out of the shower, towel wrapped around me, hair dripping onto the floor. I stared at the message, my brain scrambling for explanations. A wrong number, a prank. I glanced at the bathroom mirror. The glass was still fogged up. No windows open, no way anyone could see me. I locked my phone and tossed it onto the bed, shaking off the unease. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but then another text. You shouldn't ignore me. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. My fingers hovered over the screen, unsure whether to reply or block the number. Whoever this was, they knew something they shouldn't. I checked my front door, locked. Windows, secure. The only way someone could see me was if they were inside, or if there was a camera. My eyes darted around the room, scanning for anything. Out of place. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the heater. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was nothing, a coincidence, maybe a wrong number. I decided to test it. I typed out a message. "Who is this?" and hit send. The reply came instantly. "You look worried, don't be." My stomach flipped. I hadn't sent any pictures. There was no way they could see me. I rushed to check the peephole, the hallway outside empty. My hands were trembling now. I needed to know where these messages were coming from. I turned on my laptop, heart pounding, and opened the Wi-Fi settings. If this was some kind of hack, maybe I could trace the network. That's when I saw it. The messages were being sent from a device connected to the Wi-Fi of my downstairs neighbor. I froze. My downstairs neighbor. I had barely ever seen him. The apartment below mine had its blinds always drawn, the door always shut. I didn't even know his name. My breath hitched as a new thought settled in. Had he been watching me? I swallowed hard and grabbed my phone again, my fingers fumbling to call the police. As I waited for the dispatcher to pick up, another message appeared. "You're making this difficult." My stomach twisted. They knew. Somehow, they knew I was calling for help. I hung up immediately, heart hammering. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't know what to say. Then another text. "You shouldn't have looked." I felt sick. My skin prickled as if 100 unseen eyes were on me. I turned off my phone screen, my breathing shallow. I needed to get out. I grabbed my keys, shoved my feet into my sneakers, and bolted for the door. My hands shook as I unlocked it, my mind racing. Should I go downstairs, run outside? My instincts screamed at me to leave, but the thought of stepping into the dimly lit hallway exposed made my stomach turn. What if he was waiting? Then another vibration. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. Too late. I slammed the door shut. I pressed my back against the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. My mind was spiraling. Was he outside? Inside? I had checked all the locks, hadn't I? The apartment suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my grip slick with sweat, and crept toward the window. The streetlights outside flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across my floor. I peered through the blinds, scanning for movement. Nothing. Then a knock. Soft, deliberate. I choked back a gasp. It wasn't from the front door. It was coming from the vent. I stared at the vent, my breath caught in my throat. That didn't make sense. The vents were too small for anyone to fit inside. But the knock, it had been real. My grip on the knife tightened as I took slow, careful steps toward it. The metal slats were slightly loose, shifting just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness behind them. My mind raced, piecing together the horrifying possibility. Had he been inside my walls this whole time? Before I could react, my phone buzzed. Again, a new message. "I like this game." I felt a scream clawing at my throat, but I swallowed it down. I couldn't lose it now. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the knife. I needed to move. I needed to get out. But every part of me was frozen in place, staring at that dark gap behind the vent. Was something in there? Watching me? My stomach churned at the thought. Then outside, the sound of heavy footsteps, the police. Relief crashed over me so hard, I nearly collapsed. I ran to the door and flung it open just as two officers reached my floor. "Inside," I gasped, pointing toward the vent. "Someone's in there." Or they were. The messages. They knew everything. I was rambling, but I didn't care. I wasn't crazy. This was real. The officers exchanged a glance before stepping inside, hands hovering near their holsters. One moved toward the vent while the other swept the apartment, checking every corner. I held my breath. The officer near the vent knelt down, fingers brushing over the loose slats. "It's been tampered with," he muttered, pulling out a flashlight and shining it inside. I couldn't see his face, but I saw the way his shoulders stiffened. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. He reached inside, then jerked back suddenly as if something had moved. Then, from the hallway, a voice. "Clear!" The officer near the vent stood, shaking his head. "Whoever it was, they're not here now." His partner turned toward me. "But we did find something downstairs." My stomach tightened. "Your neighbor's apartment was empty. No furniture. No signs of anyone living there." He paused, glancing at his colleague before adding, "Except for one thing, a single phone sitting on the floor, still unlocked." My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, I really didn't, but my eyes dropped to the screen anyway. "See you soon." The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 2. We had only lived in Capitol Hill for a few months when our neighbor, Mr. Langley, first knocked on our door. It was early evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the brownstone buildings. I remember because we had just sat down for dinner when the knock came. 3 slow, deliberate taps. My wife, Emily, glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. We weren't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, there he stood, a man in his 60s, neatly dressed, holding a ceramic plate covered with foil. His smile was wide, but didn't quite reach. His eyes. "I thought I'd come introduce myself," he said, his voice warm yet oddly measured. "I live just across the hall, saw you two moving in a while back, figured a welcome gift was in order." He lifted the plate slightly. "Homemade, chocolate cake, my specialty." There was something about him too familiar, too at ease. Before we could even respond, he continued, "Must be nice working from home, huh? And Emily, you've got that long commute. Must be exhausting." My stomach twisted. We had never spoken to this man before. How did he know our schedules? Emily let out a polite laugh, but I could feel the tension in her shoulders as she stepped forward to take the plate. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Langley," she said, her voice carefully neutral. I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, really appreciate it." He lingered in the doorway, his gaze flickering between us as if studying our reactions. "It's important to be neighborly," he added, almost as an afterthought. "People should look out for each other." There was something unsettling about the way he said it, like a statement rather than a friendly sentiment. After a few more pleasantries, he finally turned and walked back to his apartment. As soon as the door shut, Emily set the cake down on the counter and exhaled. "That was weird, right?" she asked, rubbing her arms. I nodded. Really weird. We didn't know much about our neighbors, and until that moment, I hadn't thought much about it. But now, knowing that Mr. Langley had been watching us, enough to know our daily routines, sent a small ripple of unease through me. Still, we tried to shake it off. After all, maybe he was just an overly friendly old man. Later that night, after finishing dinner, we decided to try the cake. It sat on the counter untouched, as if waiting for us. "Might as well," Emily said, slicing 2 pieces. The rich scent of chocolate filled the kitchen, but as I took a bite, something felt off. The texture was slightly uneven, almost grainy. I frowned but didn't say anything. Emily, however, suddenly stopped chewing. She reached into her mouth and pulled something out, a tiny, crumpled piece of paper. Her eyes widened as she carefully unfolded it with trembling fingers. There was a single sentence written in smudged ink. "You shouldn't trust strangers." A chill ran down my spine. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of joke. But why would our neighbor bake a warning into a cake? Emily stared. At the note, her face pale. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. I grabbed the rest of my slice, breaking it apart with my fingers. Sure enough, another tiny piece of paper was wedged deep inside the cake, barely visible through the moist crumbs. The realization settled in my chest like a lead weight. This wasn't a coincidence. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I turned the note over, but there was nothing on the back, just those 5 unsettling words. Emily rubbed her arms, her breath shallow. "This isn't normal," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would he do this?" My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he thought it was a joke. Maybe it was some bizarre old man wisdom wrapped in cryptic delivery. Or maybe it was something else entirely. I stood up abruptly, pushing my plate away. "I'm going to talk to him." But Emily grabbed my wrist. "No," she said sharply. "If he wanted to scare us, confronting him might make it worse." She was right. Something about the way he had watched us earlier, the way he had known too much, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just a neighborly gesture. He had been paying attention, watching, and now he wanted us to know. I checked the peephole, half expecting to see him standing there waiting, but the hallway was empty. Still, an unsettling feeling lingered, like we weren't truly alone. Emily grabbed her phone. "I'm looking him up," she muttered, fingers flying across the screen. A moment later, she frowned. Nothing, no social media, no public records, just an old property listing with his name attached. That was odd. Almost everyone had some kind of online presence, even if it was minimal. It was like Mr. Langley barely existed. A soft sound made us both freeze. A slow, deliberate knock, 3 taps just like before. My breath caught in my throat. Emily clutched my arm, eyes wide. We stared at each other, unsure of what to do. Then, after a long pause, his voice drifted through the door. Enjoying the cake? His tone was light, conversational, but hearing it in that moment, after everything, made my skin crawl. Neither of us moved. We just stood there listening. After a few seconds, we heard him chuckle softly. And then, the sound of his door clicking shut. We didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every distant sound in the building felt magnified, like someone or something was waiting just beyond our door. Emily insisted we throw the rest of the cake away, and I agreed. But even after it was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had let something cross a boundary, something we couldn't take back. Mr. Langley had watched us. He knew things, and the worst part, he wanted us to know that he knew. The next morning, I worked up the nerve to check the hallway. His door was slightly ajar. My stomach twisted. I knocked once, lightly, no response. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open an inch more. The apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no belongings, Just dust and an abandoned plate on the counter covered in dried chocolate crumbs. Mr. Langley had never lived there. Now that you've heard this story, tell me, have you ever felt like someone was watching you even when you were alone? If you have, maybe you weren't wrong. Share your experiences in the comments. And whatever you do, don't trust the neighbor with the too perfect smile. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 3. I moved to Miami Beach a few months ago, renting a small but decent apartment near the shore. The building wasn't anything fancy, just an old 6-story complex with peeling paint and a narrow lobby that always smelled faintly of salt and mildew. It was mostly retirees living there, people who had probably been in Miami since the 80s. I kept to myself, but there was one neighbor I couldn't help but notice, an old man who lived in the unit directly, across from mine. He never left, never. But every day, at every hour, I'd see him sitting by his window, staring down at the street below. Not watching TV, not reading, not even moving much, just staring. At first, I assumed he was just lonely, maybe a widower, with nowhere to go. But something about him unsettled me. His expression never changed. His gaze never wavered. I'd come home from work at random times, and there he'd be, motionless, his face pressed close to the glass. Sometimes I'd feel his eyes on me as I walked into the building. I even tested it once, left my apartment at 3 a.m. just to grab a soda from the gas station down the block. When I returned barely 10 minutes later, he was still there, watching. One evening, after a long day at work, I finally decided to wave at him. Just a simple neighborly gesture. He didn't react, didn't blink. It was as if he hadn't even registered my movement. That was the moment I realized something was seriously off. I had seen people zone out before, but this was different. He wasn't just lost in thought. He was completely still, rigid, like a mannequin propped up against the window. The only thing that ever seemed to change was his clothes. Some days he wore a faded blue polo, other days a plain white t-shirt. But his posture, his position, always the same. Then last night the power went out. Miami Beach isn't a stranger to blackouts, especially during storm season, so I didn't think much of it at first. The entire street went dark, the only light coming from the occasional passing car or the distant glow of the city skyline. I stepped onto my balcony for some air, out of habit more than anything. And that's when I saw him. For the first time since I moved in, the old man was outside, standing on the sidewalk directly below his apartment. I froze. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. He was out. After all these months of being glued to that damn window, he was standing right there, beneath the flickering streetlights. His posture was strange. His shoulders slumped, his head tilted slightly forward, as if he were listening for something. The darkness swallowed most of his features, but I could tell he was barefoot, just standing there, completely still. I wanted to believe this was a good thing. Maybe he had finally decided to step outside, to breathe fresh air for once. But something didn't sit right. His presence felt wrong, like he didn't belong out. There, my eyes darted up instinctively to his window, half expecting it to be empty. Instead, my stomach dropped, because he was still there. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, it was unmistakable. The same. Old man was standing on the sidewalk, yet he was also still in his window, sitting in that familiar rigid posture. But now, something was different. His face, the version of him in the window, was smiling, a slow, deliberate grin that stretched too wide, like he knew I was watching, like he wanted me to see. A cold wave of dread rolled through me. I looked back down at the sidewalk, expecting the man below to have moved, to have reacted in some way. But he hadn't. He was still standing there, frozen, staring straight ahead. Not at me, not at his own window, just at the empty street, as if waiting for something unseen. My pulse hammered in my ears. I wanted to call out to him, to confirm he was real, but something deep inside me screamed not to. Instead, I slowly backed away from the balcony, gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. This wasn't possible. There couldn't be two of him, and yet I was seeing it with my own eyes. Then, as if on cue, the power flickered back on. The sudden glow from the streetlights and apartments washed over the scene in an instant. I snapped my gaze back to the sidewalk. Empty. The old man was gone. My chest tightened as I turned my eyes upward to the window across from mine. He was still there, but now he wasn't just smiling. He was waving. My breath caught in my throat. The wave wasn't friendly. It was slow, deliberate, like he was acknowledging me in some unspoken way. A confirmation that he knew I had seen. I stepped back into my apartment, my hands trembling as I locked the balcony door. My mind scrambled for rational explanations. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the darkness and the blackout had played tricks on me, but deep down I knew what I had seen. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his smile, his wave, the way he had been standing outside and in his window at the same time. The next morning, I forced myself to check. I pulled back my curtains just enough to peek across the street. He was still there, in his usual spot, staring down at the street like nothing had happened, like he hadn't been outside at all. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know if anyone else had noticed him, if I was losing my mind. That afternoon, I casually asked the building manager about the old man in the window. "Oh, Mr. Delacroix," he said, furrowing his brows. "Yeah, he used to sit there all the time, but he passed away last year." My stomach dropped. I tried to argue, to tell him I had seen him every single day since I moved in, but the manager just gave me a pitying look and shrugged. "Must be some other guy then," he muttered. But I knew it wasn't. That night I refused to look at the window. I closed my blinds, buried myself under the covers and forced my eyes shut. But as I lay there, heart pounding, I felt it, that inexplicable sensation of being watched. And then, just as sleep started to take me, a soft knock echoed from my window on the 6th floor. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 4. I moved to Vegas last year for work. Nothing glamorous, just a receptionist job at a mid-tier hotel on the Strip. The pay was decent, and my tiny studio apartment was just a few blocks away. It wasn't the nicest neighborhood, but it wasn't terrible either. I liked the convenience, the neon glow that never really let the city sleep. It felt alive, constant, like nothing could creep in unnoticed. But I was wrong. At first, it was easy to brush off. A couple of times I came home and found my door unlocked. I'd pause, heart pounding, before convincing myself I'd just been careless. Maybe I was in a rush that morning. Maybe I was distracted by a text or thinking about work. It happens, right? But it kept happening. 3-4 times a week. I started double-checking, even taking pictures before leaving just to reassure myself later. And yet, every so often, I'd come back to find the door slightly ajar, the lock undone. I told myself it was paranoia. Living alone for the first time can do that to you. But there was this gnawing feeling, a quiet dread settling in the back of my mind. What if I wasn't just forgetting? What if someone had been inside? I started checking my things, looking for anything missing or out of place. Nothing was. That should have been comforting, but somehow it wasn't. If it were a burglary, at least it would make sense. This felt different. Like someone wanted in, but not for my belongings. So I bought an extra lock, a deadbolt, one of those thick ones you see in older apartments. My landlord was too lazy to care, and I figured an extra layer of security would help me sleep at night. It worked for a while. I still checked the door obsessively before leaving, snapping a quick photo as proof. But every time I came home, both locks were still in place. No more surprises. I was finally able to breathe, to relax a little. Then last night happened. I got home late, past midnight, after covering an extra shift. The strip was still buzzing with life, but my street was quieter, darker. I walked up the stairs to my apartment, already fishing for my keys in my bag, when I stopped cold in front of my door. The deadbolt was unlocked. My stomach dropped. I knew without a doubt that I had locked it before leaving. My hands shook as I reached for the knob, hesitating. If someone was inside, would I hear them? Would they hear me? I pressed my ear against the door, listening. Silence. I tried to tell myself it was just another mistake, another lapse in memory. But then, as I slid my key into the lock, I heard it. Soft, deliberate movement on the other side. My breath hitched. And then, as I turned the key, the knob twisted under my hand, as if someone was trying to open it from the inside. I froze. For a second, neither of us moved. The person on the other side of the door and me, both gripping the handle. My pulse pounded in my ears and my body screamed at me to run. But I couldn't. I was locked in place, my fingers still wrapped around the cold metal, unable to breathe, unable to think. Then, ever so slowly, the knob twisted again, just a fraction, like whoever was on the other side was testing my grip. Panic finally kicked in. I yanked my hand away as if burned and stumbled back, nearly dropping my keys. My first instinct was to run, to bolt down the stairs and never look back. But my phone was inside. My wallet. My entire life. If I left, I'd have nothing. I stood there shaking, staring at the door, waiting for it to fly open, but it didn't. The knob stopped turning. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I forced myself to move, stepping back just enough to put space between me and the door. My mind raced through my options. Call the cops, bang on a neighbor's door. But what would I even say? There's someone in my apartment, but nothing is missing. Would they even believe me? My fingers fumbled for my phone before I remembered it was inside. That realization sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I was trapped outside my own home, with no way to call for help. And then the door creaked, just barely. Not enough to open, not enough to see inside, but enough to know that whoever was in there was still standing on the other side, still listening, still waiting. I backed up another step, my heartbeat hammering in my chest, and then I did something I hadn't planned. I spoke. "Who's there?" My voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper. Silence. And then, after a long, agonizing moment, a sound that made my blood run cold. A click. Not the door, not footsteps. Something softer, sharper, like a fingernail tapping against wood. Tap, tap, tap. Right against the doorframe. Slow and deliberate. My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't a rush to escape or a scramble to hide. It was calculated, controlled. They knew I was there. They wanted me to hear them. I couldn't take it. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran down the stairs. My only thought was getting away, getting to someone, anyone. My neighbor, an older man who always left his TV blaring late into the night, was my first stop. I pounded on his door, heart in my throat, whispering frantic pleas under my breath. Seconds stretched into eternity before the door finally cracked open. Mr. Alvarez squinted at me, clearly irritated. "What the hell, kid? It's late." I didn't care. "Someone's in my apartment," I gasped. "They unlocked my door. I heard them." His annoyed expression shifted into something more serious, but he still hesitated. I could tell. He thought I was overreacting. "Did you see anyone?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, but they were right there. I heard them." He sighed, but stepped out into the hallway, muttering something about crazy kids and too much caffeine. Together, we climbed back up the stairs. My door was just as I had left it, shut, locked now, as if nothing had ever happened. Mr. Alvarez knocked, then tried the handle. It was solid. "No one's in there," he said. "See?" I didn't know what to say. I had felt them, heard them, but standing there in the dim hallway, it all felt unreal. Maybe I was losing it. Still, I couldn't bring myself to go inside alone. Mr. Alvarez, seeing my hesitation, grumbled something under his breath and stepped in first. He flicked on the lights, checked the bathroom, the closet. Nothing. The place was exactly as I had left it. No open windows, no signs of forced entry. No one hiding in the shadows. "Told you," he said, shaking his head. "You probably just forgot to lock up and freaked yourself out." I wanted to argue, to insist that I knew what I heard, but standing there in the silence with nothing out of place, my own certainty started to crumble. I mumbled a thank you as he left, locking up behind him. I double-checked the deadbolt, then the extra lock. Then I dragged a chair in front of the door, just in case. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and whisper of the building settling, but nothing happened. No footsteps, no tapping, just silence. And yet, when I woke up this morning, groggy and unsettled, my stomach dropped, because sitting right by my front door, neatly placed on the floor, was my set of spare keys, the one I always kept hidden in my kitchen drawer. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 5. I've been a freelance photographer in New York City for almost a decade now. Street photography is my passion, capturing fleeting moments of life in a city that never stops moving. I love the randomness of it, the stories frozen in time, the people lost in their own worlds. But in the past week, I've noticed something that has made me question everything I thought I knew about my own work. At first, it was just a coincidence, or at least that's what I told myself. A man, always in the background, always looking directly at my camera. The first time I noticed him, I was reviewing my shots from Times Square. A sea of faces, neon lights painting everything in blues and reds, the usual chaotic beauty of the city. And there he was, a tall man in a dark coat, standing completely still while everyone else moved around him. His face was expressionless, eyes locked onto my lens, as if he knew I was taking the photo. I thought it was odd, but nothing. More than that, New York is full of weird people. The second time, it was harder to ignore. I was shooting near Bryant Park, focusing on the reflections in the glass buildings, when I caught him again. Same dark coat, same unsettling stare. But this time, he was closer. Maybe 20 feet away, still motionless, still staring directly at me. A chill crawled up my spine, but I shook it off. Just another city oddball, right? Maybe he liked being photographed. Maybe he was following me. The thought made me uneasy, but I convinced myself it was paranoia. By the third time, I couldn't explain it away. I was in a completely different part of the city, Lower East Side, shooting a nighttime series of dimly lit alleyways and neon reflections in puddles. And there he was again, standing at the mouth of an alley, his face half hidden in the shadows. This time, I felt it, the wrongness. I didn't just see him, I felt his presence, like static in the air, like a weight pressing against my ribs. I left immediately, pretending I hadn't noticed him, but my hands shook as I scrolled through the photos on my way home. The next morning I went through my recent shots again, searching for some kind of rational explanation. Maybe he was just a local who happened to be in the same places as me, but as I flipped through the images, my stomach twisted. He wasn't just appearing in the background, he was getting closer. In every new photo, he had moved forward, inching his way toward me like some eerie game of red light, green light. And then I noticed something even worse. In each shot, his face remained exactly the same. The same expression, the same unblinking stare. No movement, no blur, just frozen, like he wasn't part of the world around him. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. So that afternoon, I went back out with a plan. I'd shoot in a completely new location, a spot I hadn't visited. In months, Coney Island. Crowds, open space, nowhere for someone to conveniently appear in the background without me noticing. I spent hours capturing the decayed beauty of the off-season boardwalk, the empty Ferris wheel, the neon glow of abandoned arcades. It was a good shoot. No sign of him, no staring figure in the distance. For the first time in days, I felt a weight lift off my chest. Maybe it really had been a coincidence. That relief didn't last. When I got home and uploaded the photos, my hands went cold. He was there, again. I hadn't seen him at the time. I was sure of it. But in the images, he was unmistakable, standing at the edge of the boardwalk, slightly out of focus, facing me, closer than ever. My breath hitched as I scrolled through the sequence. In each frame, he inched forward. At first, he was barely visible in the distance. Then, halfway, down the pier, then just a few feet behind me. My stomach twisted as I reached the last shot. It was different, blurry, too close. My own face filled most of the frame, eyes wide with confusion, lips slightly parted, like I had just realized something was behind me. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. Over my shoulder, just barely visible in the motion blur, was him, right behind me, his face still expressionless, still staring. I shot up from my desk, heart hammering in my chest. I spun around, expecting, no, dreading, to see him standing there. But my apartment was empty, silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the city outside my window. I paced, trying to steady my breathing, forcing myself to think logically. Maybe it was some kind of prank. Maybe someone had been following me, aware of my routine, inserting themselves into my photos to mess with me. But how? How could he always be looking at the camera, always in perfect focus, despite the motion around him? And how the hell had he gotten so close without me noticing? I decided I needed proof, something to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I grabbed my camera, flipped it to live view, and turned it on myself, angling the screen to check behind. Me. Just an empty room. I exhaled, feeling stupid for even trying. But as I moved to put the camera down, something flickered on the screen. A shadow, shifting in the dim light. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I lifted the camera again, adjusting. The focus. The screen showed my reflection in the darkened window, and behind me, standing in the doorway, was him. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked over my chair, but there was nothing there, just the empty doorway leading into the darkened hallway of my apartment. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned back to the camera, my fingers gripping it so tightly they ached. The screen still showed the reflection in the window, and he was still there, closer now, just behind me. My breath hitched. I didn't turn around this time. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to leave the apartment, to never come back. But I couldn't move. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing against my chest. Then the screen went black. The camera powered off on its own, and in that final instant before the screen cut out, I swear I saw him smile. Now that you've read this, check your latest photos. Look at the backgrounds carefully. If you see someone staring directly at you, don't ignore it. Don't dismiss it, and whatever you do, don't turn around. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 1. I moved to Hollywood Hills a month ago, chasing that impossible dream, becoming a screenwriter in a city already drowning in scripts. My new house wasn't much, a small mid-century rental perched on the edge of a winding road, overlooking the city. It was quiet, isolated, perfect for writing. The first person I met was Mr. Langley, my only neighbor. He was in his 70s, with a kind but weathered face, and a voice that always carried a trace of amusement. He reminded me of an old Hollywood actor, the kind that once played villains but was too charming to be hated. On my first night, after helping me carry some boxes inside, he gave me a strange warning. No matter what you hear, never open the door after midnight. I laughed, assuming it was a joke, one of those urban legends meant to spook newcomers, but his face stayed serious. "Promise me," he said, his voice lower. "People around here, they don't always stay where they should." I nodded, humoring him. But in the back of my mind, the words lingered. For the first few weeks, life in the hills was peaceful. My days were spent hunched over my laptop, and my nights were filled with the distant hum of the city below. I grew used to the eerie silence of my new home, the way the wind howled through the canyon, the occasional rustling of leaves outside my window. I even started to appreciate the solitude. Mr. Langley was a kind presence, always waving when I passed his house. Sometimes he'd stop by with fresh lemons from his tree, chatting about the city, the history of the neighborhood, or the strange things he'd seen in his decades living here. I never pressed him about his midnight warning, though I figured it was just one of those things old people say, some superstition or relic of the past. Then one night, it happened. I had stayed up late, struggling with a scene in my script. The clock on my laptop read 12:37 a.m. when I heard it, a frantic pounding on my front door. It wasn't a polite knock, not someone hesitating. It was desperate. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The pounding came again, harder this time, rattling the doorframe. Then a voice, strained, urgent. "Please, help me, let me in." I pushed back from my desk, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The voice sounded familiar, but distorted by fear. I crept toward the door, my bare feet soundless against the hardwood. I hesitated, remembering Mr. Langley's warning. My fingers hovered over the lock, my breath shallow. Then, through the peephole, I saw him, Mr. Langley. He stood on my porch, his face twisted with fear, his hands trembling as he pounded on the door. I nearly opened the door on instinct, but something felt wrong. His eyes were wild, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Please," he gasped, "something is in my house. Let me in." A chill ran down my spine. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance toward the living room, where Mr. Langley was already inside, asleep on my couch. My stomach twisted. I looked back through the peephole. The Mr. Langley outside was still there, his eyes now darting anxiously over his shoulder, like he was being chased. Inside, the other Mr. Langley shifted slightly on the couch, letting out a soft sigh in his sleep. My mind refused to make sense of it. This wasn't possible. The pounding on the door grew more frantic. "Please, you have to let me in." The voice was desperate, pleading, but my body refused to move. I took a shaky step backward, my pulse hammering in my ears. I glanced at the sleeping Mr. Langley again. His breathing was steady, peaceful, too peaceful, like he wasn't really asleep, like he was just waiting. The pounding stopped. Silence stretched through the house, thick and suffocating. I turned back to the door. Mr. Langley was gone. The porch was empty, the night still. But something told me he hadn't just left. Behind me, from the couch, came a quiet, rasping whisper. "You did the right thing." I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The words had been barely audible, but they were real. Slowly, I turned back toward the couch. Mr. Langley was awake now. His eyes were open, staring at me, but something about them was wrong. Too dark, too empty, and then he smiled. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 2. I've lived alone in my apartment on Central Park West for about 3 years now. It's a decent place, small but comfortable, with a view of the park if you crane your neck just right. My job keeps me busy, and I've never been the social type, so I don't really know my neighbors. That's never been a problem. At least, it wasn't until I started hearing the noises. It always happens between 2 and 3 a.m. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like heavy furniture being dragged across the hardwood floor above me. At first, I thought it was just an insomniac neighbor redecorating, but night after night, it continued. No pattern, no rhythm, just the unsettling scrape, pause, scrape, pause. Some nights it would stop after a few minutes. Other nights, it went on for hours. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself it was just an old building, maybe the heating pipes expanding, or some other mundane explanation. But then I started noticing other things. The ceiling light in my hallway would flicker faintly whenever the noise started, as if reacting to it. Sometimes I would hear a faint creaking, almost like footsteps pacing back and forth. And once, just once, I swear I heard something even stranger, a whispering voice too soft to make out the words. One night, after tossing and turning for over an hour, I decided enough was enough. I grabbed my robe and stormed out into the hallway, fully prepared to knock on my neighbor's door and demand an explanation. But when I reached the apartment directly above mine, I hesitated. The hallway was silent, unnaturally so. The air felt heavy, like the stillness before a thunderstorm. I raised my hand to knock, but stopped. Something about that door felt wrong. The door was unmarked. No nameplate, no signs of life. I pressed my ear against it, straining to hear anything. From inside, silence. Not even the faint hum of an appliance or the sound of someone shifting on the other side. It was as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. I almost convinced myself to walk away when suddenly the scraping sound started again. This time, it was right on the other side of the door. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. Someone was in there, someone had to be. I knocked hesitantly at first, then harder. Hello? My voice sounded small in the empty hallway. No answer. Just the slow, agonizing scrape of something heavy moving across the floor. I swallowed, my throat dry. Look, I don't know what you're doing in there, but it's the middle of the night. Can you keep it down? Silence. The scraping stopped immediately, as if whoever or whatever was inside had been startled by my voice. I waited, my pulse thudding in my ears. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard something that made my stomach twist into a knot. A slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. From the inside. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to get away, but I forced myself to stay put. "Who's in there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I turned the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked, but it didn't budge. Not because it was locked, but because something on the other side was holding it shut. That was enough for me. I spun on my heel and hurried back down the hall, the back of my neck prickling with the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The next morning, I went straight to the building's front desk. The night doorman, an older man named Carlos, looked up from his newspaper as I approached. "Hey, Carlos," I started, keeping my voice casual. "Do you know who lives in 6B? His expression shifted. It was subtle, but I caught it. The slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his fingers tensed around the edge of the paper. 6B, he repeated, as if the number itself unsettled him. Nobody lives there. I frowned. That can't be right. I hear noises coming from there every night, furniture moving, footsteps. Someone's in there. Carlos let out a slow breath, setting his newspaper. aside. He lowered his voice. That apartment's been empty for over a year. He hesitated, then added, but she still thinks she lives there. A cold wave washed over me. She? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Carlos glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then he leaned in. A woman used to live there, lived alone. One night, neighbors reported the same noises you're hearing, dragging furniture, pacing. When management checked the apartment the next morning, they found it empty, completely untouched. But people kept hearing the sounds, late at night, always. At the same time, his gaze locked onto mine. She never left, or at least she doesn't think she did. Now that you've read this, try not to listen too closely the next time you hear something moving in your building at night. And if you do, maybe it's best to pretend you didn't. Have you ever experienced something like this? Let me know in the comments. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 3. New Orleans has a strange way of blending the real and the unreal. The air hangs heavy with the scent of rain, cigarettes, and old history, and at night the streets glow under the yellowish light of the street lamps, as if they were part of a dream. I know this better than anyone. My name is Daniel, and I've been a saxophonist for longer than I can remember. Every night, after playing in the bars on Bourbon Street, I like to play a little on my apartment balcony, just me and the city. That's how I noticed him for the first time. In the building next door, an old red brick structure with tall windows, someone always appeared in the same window whenever I started playing. A still silhouette, half lit, as if listening intently. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor enjoying the music, which wasn't unusual around here. But something felt off. I never saw this person enter or leave the building. I never saw the lights change in brightness. Just that presence, night after night, motionless, watching. By the 5th or 6th night, I started playing on purpose, waiting for him. And he always appeared. It wasn't until I decided to wave that I felt the first chill. The silhouette didn't react, didn't nod, didn't lift a hand, just stood there staring at me. That night, I slept uneasily. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every night, without fail, the figure appeared in that same window. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just an old man who enjoyed music, someone set in their ways. But the way they stood there, so still, so unnervingly quiet, started to gnaw at me. One night, I played a slower, melancholic tune, something raw and full of longing. I watched the window closely, hoping for some sign of life, some proof that I wasn't just imagining things. And then it happened, just for a moment, a shift, a flicker of movement like a hand pressing against the glass. It sent a chill through me, but it also sparked something else, curiosity. The next night I played again, this time deliberately choosing a song I hadn't performed before. As soon as the first few notes filled the air, the figure appeared, in the window, just like always. But this time, I noticed something different. The glass was slightly fogged, as if someone had been breathing against it. My stomach tightened. I don't know what possessed me, but I decided to test something. I abruptly stopped playing mid-song and waited. Seconds passed. Then, slowly, ever so faintly, I saw it. The movement of a shadow shifting behind the curtain, almost as if it was waiting for me to continue. That was the moment I knew I had to find out who or what was listening. Curiosity outweighed my unease, so the next day, just before sunset, I made my way to the building next door. The front door was unlocked, but the place felt abandoned the moment I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust, and the wooden floors creaked beneath my feet like they hadn't been disturbed in years. I climbed the narrow staircase, my heart pounding with every step. When I reached the apartment I had seen from my balcony, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I pushed it open and immediately noticed the dust-covered furniture, the faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. It was obvious. This place had been empty for a long time. But then, on the small wooden table in the center of the room, something stood out. Amid the thick layer of dust, there was a single clean space, as if something had recently been moved. My breath caught as I stepped closer. Lying there, in that untouched spot, was a piece of paper. The edges were crisp, the ink fresh. I picked it up with trembling fingers and read the words scrawled across it. "Play that song again." A shiver ran down my spine. The handwriting was uneven, almost frantic, as if whoever wrote it had done so in a hurry or desperation. I glanced around the apartment again, suddenly hyper-aware of how quiet it was. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on me like an unseen weight. I turned toward the window, the same window where the figure had always stood. From this angle, I could see my own balcony across the street, the place where I had been playing. Night after night, the realization sent a chill through me. Whoever had been watching me had been standing right here. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the note. The dust on the floor was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been here recently. And yet, the paper was fresh, untouched by time or decay. That was impossible. Someone had to have placed it here. Someone who had been in this room after I played last night. A sudden creak echoed from the hallway. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door was still open, but the silence that followed was suffocating. I wasn't alone, or at least I didn't feel alone anymore. I took a slow step toward the door, my breath shallow. The hallway stretched before me, dim and silent, but something felt off. It was the kind of silence that listens, the kind that waits for you to make the next move. I debated whether to call out, but some instinct deep inside screamed at me not to. Instead, I turned back to the table, staring at the note as if it might change before my eyes. "Play that song again." The words pulsed in my mind, unsettling and insistent. Whoever left this message, whoever had been watching me, wanted something, and somehow I had the feeling that ignoring it wasn't an option. I needed to get out of there. My gut twisted with the overwhelming sense that I had overstepped, that I had gone looking for something I was never meant to find. Clutching the note, I backed toward the door, careful not to make a sound. But as I stepped into the hallway, a soft noise stopped me in my tracks. It was faint, so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it. A breath, a whisper of air shifting through the apartment behind me. My skin prickled. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out before I saw something I wasn't ready to see. I forced myself to move, stepping quickly but carefully down the hallway, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out every other sound. The building felt colder now, like the walls themselves had exhaled a breath of icy air. I reached the staircase and descended, as fast as I could without running, refusing to look back. When I finally burst onto the street, the humid New Orleans night wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. The lights of Bourbon Street flickered in the distance, the familiar sounds of jazz and laughter filling the air. Normalcy. I clung to it, to the life and movement around me, trying to shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that building. Back in my apartment, I locked the door behind me, my hands still trembling. I paced to the balcony, needing to see that window again, needing proof that I had imagined everything. But when I looked up, the apartment across the street was dark. No figure, no movement, just an empty window staring back at me. For the first time in a week, I didn't pick up my saxophone. The note lay on my coffee table, the words burning into my mind. "Play that song again." It felt like a demand, a command that lingered in the air even in its silence. But I didn't play. Not that night, not the next. I told myself it was over. 2 nights passed without music. I tried to convince myself that it was just a strange coincidence, that someone had simply left the note as a joke or some forgotten relic of the past. But deep down, I knew better. Bourbon Street never sleeps, yet my apartment felt quieter than ever, unnaturally so. Then, on the 3rd night, just as I was starting to believe it was over, I woke up to a sound I knew too well, the distant, sorrowful wail of a saxophone. It wasn't coming from the street. It wasn't from one of the bars below. It was coming from across the street, from the empty apartment. Now tell me, if you were in my place, would you play that song again? The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 4. I moved into my apartment on Lakeshore Drive a few months ago. It was a dream spot. Lake views, a cozy space, and most importantly, peace. Living alone had its challenges, but I liked my independence. My job as a freelance designer let me work odd hours, so I rarely saw my neighbors. The only real sign of life above me was the occasional muffled footsteps at night, or the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. Nothing unusual until I noticed something off. It started small. One afternoon, I stepped into the elevator and caught a faint scent in the air. My perfume. Not just any perfume, but the one I had sprayed on myself minutes earlier. A niche. Fragrance, nothing mainstream. Maybe someone else wore it too. Strange, but not impossible. Then a few days later, I passed by my building's glass entrance and caught a glimpse of someone ahead of me. A man, maybe in his early 30s, wearing the exact same jacket I had on. Same cut, same shade. Even the way the fabric folded around. The collar! I hesitated but brushed it off. Coincidences happen. A week later I was checking my mail when I saw him again, the man from upstairs. He stood by the lobby mirror, adjusting his scarf. My scarf. Not an identical one, the same one. I recognized the loose thread near the hem, the small stain I could never fully wash out. My stomach tightened. Maybe he just had something similar, but when he turned to leave, I saw his reflection in the mirror. His hair, the same cut as mine. A recent trim, just like the one I'd gotten 2 days ago. I almost said something, but my voice caught in my throat. I tried to shake it off, but once I started paying attention, the similarities kept piling up. One evening I spotted him leaving his apartment wearing a deep green sweater. I had just bought one exactly like it. Another day, I saw him carrying a canvas tote bag, the kind I used for groceries. Even the way he walked felt eerily familiar, like watching a shadow of myself moving ahead. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was paranoia. Coincidences, that's all. Then last night something happened that I can't explain away. I was coming back late, my arms full of groceries, when I heard footsteps behind me in the hallway. Slow, deliberate. I glanced back. Him. He was walking a few feet. Behind, his hands tucked into the pockets of a navy coat, the exact coat I was wearing. My skin prickled. I fumbled with my keys, trying to act normal. As I unlocked my door, he spoke my name. I froze. We had never spoken before. I turned to face him, my mouth dry. "How do you know my name?" I asked. He just smiled, tilting his head slightly. "I'm you," he said, "just first." His voice was calm, almost amused, like he was stating a fact. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to laugh, call him crazy, but the way he was looking at me, like he knew something I didn't, made my breath catch. I forced a nervous chuckle. "Right, that's weird," I said, gripping my keys tighter. He didn't move. just kept staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, a mix of amusement and something else, something unsettling. I stepped backward into my apartment and shut the door, locking it instantly. My heart was racing. What the hell was that? I pressed my ear against the door, listening. Silence, no footsteps walking away, no sound of a door opening upstairs. He was still there. Minutes passed, my breathing slowed. Maybe I misheard him, maybe I was overreacting. I moved to my bedroom, still feeling a nagging unease, and sat on the edge of my bed. That's when my phone buzzed, a notification, airdrop request from you. My blood ran cold. My hands trembled as I hesitated. Then, against every instinct, I tapped accept. A single photo appeared on my screen. It was me, but it wasn't just any photo of me. It was taken from inside my apartment. The angle was unmistakable. My desk, my coffee mug, my reflection faintly visible in the dark window behind me. A photo I never took. My stomach lurched. I whipped my head toward the window, half expecting to see him standing outside. Nothing. Just the quiet city, lights flickering in the distance. My breath came in short gasps. I couldn't explain. I didn't want to. I turned off my phone, trying to shake the rising panic. Maybe it was some kind of sick prank. Maybe he hacked my phone. That had to be it. But then, before I could even process my next move, there was a soft knock. At my door, 3 precise taps, my body locked up. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The silence stretched. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a whisper came through the wood. You'll see. I wanted to scream, but my voice was gone. My body felt paralyzed, like if I moved even slightly, something would happen, something irreversible. The air in my apartment felt heavier, pressing against my chest. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling, but I didn't know who to call. What could I even say? My neighbor thinks he's me and just sent me a picture from inside my apartment. They'd think I was insane. Another knock. Louder this time. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and then my phone buzzed again. Another airdrop request. My hands shook as I looked at the screen. A video. Against every rational thought, I pressed play. The footage was grainy, dimly, lit my bedroom, my bed, and then a shape moved. Someone was sitting on the edge, their back to the camera. Me. The figure in the video slowly turned its head, my head, but before I could see its face, the screen glitched. The video cut out. My stomach twisted in knots. I spun around, eyes darting to my bedroom door, half expecting to see myself sitting there in the dark. But the room was empty, silent. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then my phone vibrated one last time. A message. No number, no contact name, just 2 words. Not yet. I didn't sleep that night. I kept every light on, every lock checked and double-checked, but somehow, deep in my bones, I knew it wouldn't matter, because this wasn't over. He wasn't just copying me. He wasn't just watching. He was waiting. And the worst part? I don't know for what. Now that you've read this, try to forget it before you go to sleep. But if you ever feel like someone is mirroring your every move, don't turn around. Not yet. The following events are based on a true story. Names and details have been altered to protect the identities of those involved, but the horror remains untouched. Watch at your own risk. Story 5. I've always loved the charm of Georgetown. The cobblestone streets, the historic brownstones, the quiet sense of dignity that lingers in the air. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a narrow townhouse, sandwiched between a cafe and an antique bookstore. It wasn't big, but it was mine. As a journalist, I spent most of my time chasing stories, buried in research or pounding away at my laptop in the dim glow of my desk lamp. It wasn't until a few weeks ago that I noticed her. The old woman across the street. Every morning, without fail, she sat on her balcony in a faded blue robe. watching. At first, I thought she was just another nosy neighbor, the kind who memorizes everyone's routines for lack of anything better to do. But then I realized she wasn't watching the street, she was watching me. At first, I tried to ignore it. I'd pull my blinds shut, turn away quickly when I felt her gaze. Maybe she was just lonely. Maybe she was losing her mind a little, as the elderly sometimes do. But the more I noticed her, the more uneasy I felt. Her stare wasn't just idle curiosity, it was knowing, intentional. Then, one morning, as I was locking my door to leave for work, I heard a raspy voice call, "Out." "Miss." I turned. The old woman stood at the edge of her balcony, one hand gripping the railing, the other holding a small, yellowed envelope. Her fingers trembled as she stretched it toward me. "He already knows that you suspect." My stomach twisted. I hesitated before stepping forward, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears. The old woman's expression was urgent, her eyes dark and unblinking. I took the envelope carefully, my fingers brushing against the brittle paper. "Who?" I started. But before I could finish, she turned and shuffled back inside, pulling the door shut behind her. I stood there for a moment, the city noise, suddenly distant, my breath shallow. A chill ran through me. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching, but the street was empty except for a passing jogger and a woman walking her dog. Just another morning in Georgetown. Except it wasn't. My hands felt stiff as I opened the envelope. Inside were photographs. My photographs, or rather photographs of my apartment, taken from the inside. My throat tightened as I flipped through them. The angle of my bedroom mirror, the view from my kitchen doorway, even a close-up of my desk, where my laptop usually sat. The shots were impossibly intimate. Whoever took them had been inside my home. I felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. Someone had been in my apartment, moving unnoticed, capturing my life. From perspectives I had never even seen myself. I turned the photographs over, looking for something, anything that might explain them. No dates, no markings, just the glossy images staring back at me, each one a violation, each one a silent confirmation that I was being watched. I looked up at the old woman's balcony. The door remained shut, curtains drawn. Had she taken these? No, that didn't make sense. Her hands had trembled when she gave me the envelope, and her voice. There had been fear in it, a deep, quiet fear that settled into my own bones. I stuffed the photos back into the envelope and hurried inside, my mind racing. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my breath uneven. Could someone have broken in while I was at work? But nothing had ever been out of place, no signs of forced entry. Still, the idea of combing through my apartment for hidden cameras made my stomach turn. I grabbed my phone and started dialing the police, but then I stopped. What would I even say? That my elderly neighbor handed me an unmarked envelope full of photos of my own apartment? That she said he knew that I was suspicious? Suspicious of what? I set my phone down, pressing my hands against my temples. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe someone had access to a spare key, my landlord, the cleaning service I used once a month. But why would they take photos? And why? Would my neighbor warn me? I paced my small living room, every creak of the floorboards making my skin prickle. My laptop sat on the coffee table, the lid closed. I stared at it. Had someone tampered with it? Could they be watching me right now? The thought sent a cold wave of dread through me. I forced myself to move, to do something. I checked the locks, deadbolt, chain secure. Then I went through every room, opening closets, looking under the bed, even checking behind the shower curtain like I was in some horror movie cliché. Nothing. Everything looked normal. But normal was a lie, wasn't it? Because I had proof that someone had been in here. I sat on the edge of my bed, my pulse still hammering. Then a sound, faint, coming from the front door, a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap. I froze. The knocking was too soft to be a delivery, too hesitant to be a neighbor just stopping by. My fingers clenched around the envelope as I forced myself to stand. Slowly, I moved toward the door, careful not to make a sound. The peephole was right in front of me, but I hesitated before looking through it. My heart pounded against my ribs. What if someone was standing there? What if they knew I was watching? I took a slow, deep breath and leaned in. The hallway outside was empty. No one stood at my door, no footsteps retreating down the hall. I waited, holding my breath, expecting another knock. But nothing came, just silence. I stepped back, pulse still racing. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe whoever knocked wanted me to know they were there, just long enough to make me question myself. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, jumping at every sound, checking the locks more times than I could count. Work emails piled up unanswered. My editor called twice, but I let it go to voicemail. I couldn't focus, not with those photographs sitting on my desk like a silent accusation. When night fell, I kept my lights off, watching the street from the sliver between my curtains. The old woman's balcony was dark. She hadn't come outside again. I thought about knocking on her door, demanding answers. But something in me resisted. What if she wasn't the one I needed to be afraid of? At some point, exhaustion won over paranoia. I curled up in bed, the envelope still clutched in my hand. I told myself I'd be fine. The locks were secure. No one could get in. But just as I started to drift into uneasy sleep, a sound made my eyes snap open. A click, faint but unmistakable. My bedroom door was opening. I couldn't breathe. My body locked in place, every muscle screaming at me to move, to do something. But I just lay there, frozen, my fingers gripping the envelope so tightly. The paper crumpled. The door opened wider, inch by inch, until the darkness beyond it swallowed the faint glow from the streetlight outside my window. My mind raced. I locked it. I know I locked it. A shadow shifted in the doorway, not a trick of the light, something real, something there. And then nothing, no footsteps, no movement, just the door, wide open, and the crushing weight of silence. My breath came in shallow gasps as I forced myself to sit up, my eyes locked on the empty space where someone, something, should have been. But I was alone. The air in the room felt heavier, pressing down on me like unseen hands. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I turned on the screen. A new notification, an image file, no sender. I tapped it open and my stomach lurched. It was a photo of me, right there in my bed, taken from the doorway, time-stamped 2 minutes ago. Now that you've read this, check your bedroom door, and if it's open, you might not be alone.